Marxist approach to literature and literary text, to be more specific, all right? We're going to review some of its assumptions, those ideas which underlie the theory, and we'll try to speak a little bit about some of its possible applications to literary texts, maybe even films. All right, because I am aware that not all students have read the texts which I might be quoting from or speaking about. So last time we talked, during the previous 2 weeks, we spoke a little bit about psychoanalysis, okay? Psychoanalysis, which was, of course, applied to literature, psychoanalytic approach to literature, to the novel, or whatever, to literature in general. And we spoke about Freud's theory. We spoke about a little bit about Carl Gustav Jung's, and tried to highlight the difference between them, namely by mentioning the difference between how Freud conceived of the unconscious and how Carl Gustav Jung conceived of the same concept. Namely, if we go into detail, we would say that for Freud, the unconscious operated at the individual level, although, of course, we should mention it. He had a claim to universality, but only in what relates to the individual as such. On the other hand, Carl Gustav Jung spoke about what is sometimes called the collective unconscious. And then also we spoke about Lacanian model, Lacan's model, okay, of psychoanalysis, and his notion, his conception of desire, and his attempt to speak about the unconscious as being structured like a language, or structured, in fact, like a language, exactly like a language. And of course, he relied on Saussure's theory of the signifier and signified, okay, in general, all right, and argued that the unconscious was structured like a language. Of course, one of the most important ideas, one of the most important insights brought about by Derrida is that the object of desire is in an ever shifting movement. Okay, it shifts from one thing to the other, and that's what makes the unconscious structured like a language. All right. Now today, of course, we're going to move to Marxism. Now, let's start by asking the following question. What would Marxist literary critics, or Marxist critics in short, say about psychoanalysis, or for that matter, all the other literary approaches? Well, they would go probably this way. Psychoanalysis is reductive in nature. if you apply psychoanalysis to literature, it would most probably give you insights into the nature of into the nature of character motivation, and psychology and so on and so forth. But then psychoanalysis, just like other literary theories, apart from Marxist literary theory, of course, are reductive in nature, or would be seen as reductive in nature, because they mask the uh, 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 the uh, the social or the material and the historical conditions that brought about that literary text, okay, in the first place, or the notions that, let me say, lie behind the construction, or the construction of a character, the way we construct him or her. All right. Now, Marxism Marxism is all about contradictions, all right? This is one basic assumption in Marxist literary criticism, or in Marxist theory as a whole. It's all about contradictions. Now, let me explain a little bit what I mean by contradictions, or what is meant by contradiction in, all right. Like contradiction. Contradictions between the ideology of a character, or the ideology of a novelist, of a writer, and reality. There is always a degree of contradiction between these two realms, okay? Now, if you take an example, in The Great Gatsby, the famous American novel written by Scott Fitzgerald, there is an interesting character whose name is Tom Buchanan. And this character, through this character, we come to know what contradiction means. Okay? We know, for instance, that this character is very rich. He is very wealthy. He is descended from a Scottish. He is of Scottish descent, and he is American, of course. But he is very wealthy, and the way he goes about his life reveals a number of contradictions between what he thinks and the reality out there. The fact that he is very rich makes him, of course, buy other people, by other women to be more precise. He buys them the same way he bought, let's say, Daisy, with whom he got married, and of course, one of the central characters in the whole novel. But then the contradiction becomes stark when we discover that Tom Buchanan, when we discover that Tom Buchanan is also a racist. He, all right, latecomers, keep coming in. Okay. Now, of course, for those who have read the novel um, they will understand what I'm talking about. But if you haven't read the novel, The Great Gatsby, then it will be a little bit difficult to understand the character of Tom Buchanan. But let me get back um, to this idea of contradiction from another perspective. You are an individual. You live in a certain society. And this society, according to Marxist literary theory or Marxism in general, it is determined by a set of social, economic, material relations. All right? In other words, if you are poor, if you are poor or you belong to a low social class, then your belonging will be reflected in the way you think or you make sense of the world outside, okay, the world out there. But then if you belong to a high social class, it's the same thing. Now, your worldview is determined. Your worldview, that is your consciousness in Marxist literary in Marxist jargon, not simply literary, but in Marxist jargon in general, your consciousness is determined by your social condition or social conditions and not the other way round. Here, if you take a look at this, for instance, if you take a look at this slide, you have the pyramid of the capitalist system. Okay, the capitalist system, you have one, two, three, four, five layers. All right, and the first tier, there are so many people. These constitute the people, the population. All right. Now, uh, 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 these are the people who work for the others and provide for all the others. What does the caption say? All right. What does the caption say? We feed you. We feed all of you. In other words, we are the ones who do the hard work. And ultimately, we are the ones who feed you. And of course, we feed you, it means we are the ones who are workers. Okay, so this is the labor force, and this is an important concept in Marxist theory. We feed you. You see that? Okay, they're holding the whole pyramid on their backs, and the whole pyramid. Now, these constitute social classes. The other classes are sustained by the working class, and above you have the military or the military force, and of course you have the priests, the clergy, religions in general. They say we fool you, all right? And then at the top, you have the class, the ruling class, which reads, we rule you. In other words, the other ones do not produce. In an opposition to the labor force, the workers, the other classes do not really create a surplus value, all right? Do not create a surplus value. And this is basically um, um, a, the class society. And of course, according to Marxism, every society is made up of social classes, all right? Social classes. Now, uh, let's move to the to the following slide. Now, we spoke about the working class. And then the working class is there to work for the others, to feed the others. Now, the problem is that that working class is not conscious of its power. It's not conscious of its power. Now, if you take society in general, Marxism conceives of society in terms of the base or the infrastructure and the superstructure. The superstructure is related to anything that has a connection with ideas. In other words, you can find politics, law, religion, education, the work environment, the media, and literature. Okay, this is the superstructure. And of course, the superstructure is, according to Marxist jargon, is only a reflection. Okay, in classical Marxism, it's a mechanical reflection, let's say, of the base or the economic aspect of the social being, or what is called the infrastructure or the base. In other words, these things which constitute the means of production, okay? How society is organized, the tools, the technological know-how, the technological change, and so forth. All right? Now, general ideas and assumptions of Marxism. Marxism, as you say, is sometimes referred to as dialectic materialism, but Marx himself did not use the expression. And dialectic materialism is derived from Hegel's dialectic method, okay? The thesis, the antithesis, and the synthesis, but applied it to history in general. Marxist criticism also is part of a larger body of theoretical analysis, which aims to understand ideologies and how ideologies are produced, but most importantly, how ideologies mask the relations of power in society. Of course, the relations of power in society on a secondary level, but on a basic level, how they mask, how these ideologies mask the relations of production. In other words, remember, I am a worker. I belong to the labor force. I feed you, but then I don't gain much from what I do. I don't really gain much because you are the ones who gain much. I am just a worker. I use my sweat. I use my body to produce something, to produce what is called surplus value. All right, but a Marxist criticism is an attempt to unmask these relations of exploitation and also ideologies, to unpack those ideologies in let's say in literature, in ideas. All right, uh, you could relate this idea of ideology to consciousness, to character consciousness, or individual consciousness. All right, for according to Marxism, uh, 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 the working class has a false consciousness. All right, a false consciousness of its power. Okay, now the third assumption is that ideology, of course, as I already mentioned, is used to refer to the ideas, values, and feelings by which men and women experience their societies at various times. So, ideology is not just ideas, but also values, okay? Or feelings, what Raymond Williams, for example, calls a structure of feelings. Now, another assumption that is central in Marxist uh, criticism or Marxist theory is that your economic situation determines your thought and not vice versa. Your thought, your ideology, let's say, your structure of feeling, let's say, your experience of the world, let us say, is determined by your economic situation. Now, if you happen, for instance, if you happen to live in, I don't know, let me give you an example. If you happen to live in Bir Qasim or in Hay Riyadh, for instance, would you have the same ideas as somebody who lives in the Warlgra or in uh, uh, um, some shanty town? Of course not. Your thoughts, your worldviews will be diametrically opposed, okay? Will be different, at least. You would not make sense of the world along the same lines, along the same thought molds. And this, according to Marxism, results from the fact that it is your economic situation that determines your ideas, your thought, your ideology. Now, another assumption is that certain of these ideas and values and feelings are only accessible through literature, okay? Are only accessible through literature, also sometimes films and so forth, okay? In other words, in order to study literature, you have to analyze how your economic or how the economic status, how your economic situation, your material conditions determine how these determine your consciousness. In other words, your thoughts, your values, and your feelings, or the structure of feelings that shape your worldview, let us say. And let's take a look at this quote by Karl Marx. Now, what does he say? He says it's not the consciousness of man that determines their existence, but on the contrary, it is their social existence that determines their consciousness. And so you see that here there is a reversal of the order between ideas and social existence. Before the advent of Marxist theory, there was an assumption that uh, ideas determined uh, people's existence. Okay, well, of course, the the ideational, let's say, setup of a human being determines his or her social existence. With the advent of Marxism, of course, these roles will be reversed. Okay, next slide. So, what is the aim of Marxist literary criticism? Well, the aim is multifaceted and diverse. One aim is to explain the literary work more fully. That is, if you approach a literary work from a psychoanalytical perspective, you would perhaps gain insights into characters' motivations, character psychology, and so forth. But then you wouldn't explain why these characters, for instance, have come to be portrayed the way they are portrayed. In other words, according to Marxist literary criticism, you have to go outside the literary texts, while of course remaining inside it, okay? Outside the literary text to look at the conditions that made that representation possible, or that made the writing of that novel possible. Okay, now of course explaining the literary work uh, from the inside would mean being sensitive to its forms, styles, and meanings. All right, now forms, literary form. The literary form, for example, if you take the novel as a literary genre, when we're speaking about the form, we're speaking about, roughly speaking, about whether it is, for example, a poem or a novel or a short story or a short story, or what is sometimes called flash fiction, whether it is an epic, and so on and so forth. In other words, form is intricately related to genre. But of course, you can also speak about form in different ways in relation to the novel, for example, all right? To the novel. But then let me say a few things about the idea of form. The advent of the novel, you'll excuse me because I can't resist smoking since I'm at home. I am here and there, so do you allow me? I suppose you won't mind, okay? I suppose you don't mind. The idea of form. Let's take the novel. Now, the novel is a recent invention. It's a very late invention. It's a European invention, of course, the novel. Now, there are some literary historians who speak about Don Quixote or Don Quixote as the first European novel. All right, there are others who go who have different ideas, okay, different positions, and say that there are other novels, okay. But then we're not interested in this, but we're interested in the advent, in the emergence of the form itself, okay? The novel as a form explains the material, the change in the material conditions in Europe through the rise of the bourgeoisie, because the novel is a genre that knew its success, knew its beginning and success with the rise of the bourgeoisie, okay, as a social class, okay? It is one that has, let's say, supplanted the epic, all right? Supplanted the epic in one way or another, all right? So is it clear? Are you following the idea of the form? Not just literary form, but the form as a literary genre itself, okay? If you read this against the epic, for example, what is the epic? The epic is a long poem. It's a classic form of poetry. But then if you try to look at the way the hero is portrayed, then you may reach, of course, you will reach, of course, uh, uh, um, some illuminating ideas, like the hero, the epic hero, is constructed like a god. All right, he, of course, he. There's no she in the epic. In the epic. All right, there's no she in the epic. There's no she, because the hero is always a powerful male who confronts all sorts of problems, all sorts of obstacles, and he thrives. He gets over them. In other words, the resolution is almost always a happy one. The epic hero is strong, handsome. He may not be rich, but he is strong and handsome and adventurous, okay? And goes and sets out into farther lands and comes back thriving, successful. This idea, this trajectory itself reflects the notion, let us say, of perfection. The epic hero is almost perfect. He is almost like a little god. He is almost a reflection of the notion of uh, 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 the powerful God. Okay, somebody who controls history, somebody who is in control of everything. No matter what happens, the epic hero will, of course, thrive. All right. So let me finish this digression. So explaining the literary work more fully entails being sensitive to its form, style, and meanings, and of course, this meaning styles, the way it is written, the style, the imagery, the metaphors, the kind of language that is used uh, uh, to compose the work of art, but also the meaning of that work of art. Now, grasping those forms and styles, according to Hegel, uh, 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 as the products of a particular history, okay? We should grasp those forms and styles and meanings because they are, according to Marxism, part of the historical conditions. All right? Now we have to distinguish in Marxism between the material condition or the socio-economic condition and the historical condition. The historical condition or the historical conditions is way more encompassing, okay, because it includes the material conditions. It's much more inclusive, okay? Uh, well, if Marxist criticism is original at all, its originality lies not in its historical approach, what I've been speaking about as the historical conditions. Um, uh, it lies not in its historical approach to literature, but in its revolutionary understanding of history itself. Okay, in the German ideology, we can find the following, which I invite you to read. Marx and Engels say the production of ideas, concepts, and consciousness is first of all directly interwoven with the material intercourse of man, what I've been referring to as the material conditions of man, of human beings. Interwoven in the language of real life, conceiving, thinking, the spiritual intercourse of man appear here as the direct efflux or flow, let us say, of men's material behavior, which, when, of course, here I stop, which these material behaviors find their way into literature, okay? Find their way into literature and constitute, in their turn, what we call ideology. And let me go back to the quote once again. We do not proceed from what men say, imagine, conceive, nor from men as described, thought of, imagined, conceived, in order to arrive at corporeal man. Rather, we produce from the really active man. In other words, it's a kind of bottom up move or movement from the reality of man. I'm using man because that's the word which was used by Marx and Engels. Okay, the reality of human beings determines their consciousness, not the other way around. And that's what you can read at the end of the quote. Consciousness does not determine life. It's life that determines consciousness. This is from the German ideology, right? So let's recap. There are general ideas and assumptions, among which we find the following. The consciousness of human beings is not determined by their ideology. Their ideology is determined by their material conditions, which is, of course, determined by the historical conditions. Okay? You are not the product of your ideas. Your ideas are the product of your social circumstances. You, as a social being, think in a determinate way, in a specific way, because of your economic situation, your material conditions, and the historical era that you are living through. Okay.
Professor,
Yes.
I just have a question about approaching a literary work from Marxist point of view. Like we should definitely include the historical era or the material or economic circumstances that made that author produce those characters into some ways and make them believe some ways.
This is one way of going about it, right? This is one way of going about it. Now, let's get back to the Great Gatsby, for instance. Now, one way to apply Marxist literary theory to the Great Gatsby would be, I'm saying one way, would be to approach the question of it as being written after World War I. And that's very important. Now, would Scott Fitzgerald have written The Great Gatsby had he not lived in that particular historical era? I don't think so. This is one way, all right? Another way would be to look at characters. There is no straitjacket way of applying Marxist literary criticism to a literary work, okay? You have to grasp the general theory, and then find your way, okay? Find your way through that maze, either by looking at the relations of production, okay? Or by the conditions of production inherent in that very novel, for example, or that poem, or that short story, or moving inside the work of art itself and trying to unpack what had gone into the language, the very language used to write the novel. Okay?
Okay, Professor, thank you.
Characterization, for example, uh, um, I don't know. You could possibly take a look at the Hunger Games, either the novel or the movie, and see if you can apply Marxist literary theory to that movie. And of course, it is it allows that. It's not just that it allows that. There's a great deal of Marxist theory into the Hunger Games, okay? Now, first, because it is set in a capitalist society. Second, because it unpacks or it reveals the relations of production and who holds power, economic power, that is, in the novel as a whole, or in the movie as a whole, if you will. All right? Does that answer your question?
Yes, Professor, thank you. I just understood it.
Thank you. Now let's move to From Marx, A Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy. This is a book by Karl Marx, published in 1855. And see what, this is from the preface. In the social production of their life, men enter into definite relations that are indispensable and independent of their will. And of course, when you're born into a family, and that family exists and is structured by other conditions, by conditions that are exterior to it, all right? The fact that your mom and dad got married, that's something that can be interpreted either in terms of ideas, in terms of love, or in terms of material conditions, and so on and so forth. Okay, the family is structured by um, a set of exterior determinants, okay? One of which is the material conditions, but also the historical circumstances which surround that very event. Okay, so you are part of, you are in fact part of a whole set of social relations, okay, of social relations, of which on which you depend. These are called the relations of production, which correspond to a definite stage of development of their material productive forces. The sum total of these relations of production constitutes, that is the sum total, constitutes the economic structure of society, which is, of course, the real foundation on which rises a legal and a political superstructure, and to which correspond definite forms of social consciousness, right? Now, let me give you an example. In Morocco, uh, it is often stated, it's in the constitution, in Morocco's constitution, it is stated that Morocco is a Muslim country. You remember, during the period in which 2010, 2011, the drafting of the constitution, during the drafting of the constitution, there was a heated debate over whether to say, whether to write, to describe, to define Morocco as an Islamic country or as a Muslim country. Did anybody think of, for example, describing Morocco as a Christian country? Can you answer me, please? Or as a country with no religion? No, of course not. It's impossible. It's simply because the sociological base is made up of a majority which is Muslim, right? A majority which is Muslim. And of course, the Constitution is, according to this perspective, uh, uh, a text, a legal text, which reflects the ideological makeup of society, those ideas in which people believe. Let me go back again to the quote. The mode of production of material life conditions the social, political, and intellectual life process in general. The mode of production of material life conditions the social, political, and intellectual life process in general, and this is, it seems to me, very clear, okay? The mode of production. Here we have mode of production nowadays. We speak about the capitalist mode of production, the capitalist mode of production, which of course distinguishes between use value, okay? The use value and other values, which of course we were going to elaborate on shortly, all right? It is not the consciousness of men that determines their being, but on the contrary, the social being, it is their social being that determines their consciousness. Again, now and again, we have this idea of human beings as social beings, and that their consciousness, their ideology, in a sense, is determined by their social conditions, which are constituted by the material conditions and the historical circumstances. Okay, historical circumstances. Okay, now let's move a little bit forward to into literary criticism as such, okay? Because Terry Eagleton is one of the most brilliant Marxist literary critics, okay? Now, he published many books on the topic, okay? And of course, Marxism and literary criticism is one such book, okay? Now, according to Terry Eagleton, to understand a work of art, so understanding a work of art, earlier we spoke about explaining a work of art, but understanding is one way of going about it, okay? Of course, you have to understand before explain. Now, understanding a work of art is therefore to do more than interpret their symbolism, okay? Study their literary history and add footnotes about sociological facts which enter into them. Like speaking about, for example, saying that, you know, somebody has sent a request. Please come on time. Thank you. Where were we? Oh my. This is it. All right. To understand, according to Terry Eagleton, to understand the work of art is therefore to do more than interpret their symbolism, study their literary history, and add footnotes about sociological facts which enter into them. It is first of all to understand the complex, indirect relations between those works and the ideological worlds they inhabit. That's what I spoke about earlier when I was answering one of your friend's questions, okay? The ideological worlds they inhabit, relations which emerge not just in themes and preoccupations, but in style, rhythm, image quality, and most importantly, in form. Art, literature, ideology, history, form, and content. Now, let's ask the following question. What is the relationship between art and literature and ideology. What is the relationship between form and content? Are form and content a direct mechanical reflection of the economic relations? What position does art literature occupy in the superstructures, in the superstructure? These are ideas, Marxist ways of approaching a literary work. Okay, what kind of ideology is being reflected in literature? If you take, for example, the Arabic novel, okay, I'm aware that not all of you know much about the Arabic novel, but I assume that you know a little bit, okay? Now, if you take Najib Mahfoud, for example, the whole oeuvre of Najib Mahfoud, and you pay attention, except of course, except for the three, his first three novels, which were set in ancient Egypt, all right, which tried to come up with, which were historical novels in a sense. Now, apart from those three early novels, if you take the whole bulk of Najib Mahfoud's oeuvre, more particularly the his trilogy, okay, the Cairo trilogy, Thulathiyya, you would be proud to see that it is set in a city. Now, one way of approaching this idea would be to look at the setting, okay, and how it reflects the set of social relations and economic relations between the characters in that trilogy, between the central character, for example, and the other characters. The central character who happens to be the patriarch, Sisayid, okay? The patriarch, okay? Now, the setting in itself is meaningful. What kind of world view does that trilogy provide? In other words, is Sisayid a prototype of the Egyptian man? Is he a model? How did he come to force himself upon the mind of Najib Mahfoud? Najib Mahfoud must surely have known somebody in real life who would later be the model for Sisayid. This is one way, okay? This is one way. Now, what is the relationship between form and content, okay? This is another question that could be that is very important in Marxist literary criticism. What is the relationship between form and content? Why do we continue, for example, to think of Arabic poetry as the most important component of literary history? Okay, why is it that, for example, poets like Al-Mutanabbi have come to survive and reach us? Okay, it's part of history, but nowadays you can find many people who identify with Al-Mutanabbi, okay, not least of whom the Moroccan novelist and university professor Ourid, for instance. Okay, now this is part of the question that that attempts to explain the relationship between form and content, but also between ideology as a set of ideas adopted by people, right? And on the one hand, and content on the other. Are form and content a direct mechanical reflection of the economic relations? Again, are form and content a direct mechanical reflection of the economic relations? I'm trying to think of an example which might be accessible to all of you. All right. Are form and content a direct mechanical reflection of the economic relations? Of course. I spoke about this earlier when I brought up the idea of the epic. Okay, the epic as a literary genre. Of course, now the epic does not exist. It's let's say a dead, literary genre. Nobody writes epics nowadays. Of course, you can't write an epic nowadays, all right? Epics like Gilgamesh and the Odyssey and the Iliad, for example. These are very, very, very long poems, okay? Now, their form and their content are intricately connected with certain strands which find their existence in the ideology prevalent during that period. Okay. Now, another question would be to ask what position that art literature occupy in the superstructure. Of course, in the superstructure, you can find law, you can find literature, and so on and so forth. But one way of um, of making use of Marxist literary criticism would be to question the position of literature in the superstructure as a whole. Okay, now let's move to the next slide. Art, literature, and concealment. Now, earlier I spoke about, I used the word mask. And of course, to conceal means to mask. It is, if you will, another word for hide. But hiding is intentional, all right? In literature, we speak of concealment and masking rather than hiding, okay? Most probably because sometimes it is done unconsciously, okay? It is done unconsciously. The writer, the novelist, the author is sometimes even not aware of what he or she is concealing. Most probably because he or she is unaware of the material conditions and the historical circumstances that surround him or her. But then, according to Marxism, real art is that which is capable of going beyond those material conditions and those historical circumstances that sometimes could curb the writer, the artist, or the novelist. Okay. Now, authentic art always transcends, goes beyond those ideological limits of its time, yielding us insight into the realities which ideology hides from view. This is a quote by Ernest Fisher, Art Against Ideology. It is quoted in Eagleton. In other words, a literary work, according to Marxist literary criticism, is of necessity an instance of concealment of the reality out there. It tries to represent that reality, but there is always more or less a degree of concealment of that reality, okay? Or masking, if you like. Art, literature, and ideology. Um, another Marxist literary critic is Althusser. Okay, the French critic, the French critic. Um, Sometimes he's qualified as a structuralist Marxist. Okay, as a structuralist Marxist because he used structuralism to interpret Marxism. Okay, Althusser argues that art cannot be reduced to ideology. It is rather a kind of particular relationship to that ideology. Ideology signifies everything that is imaginary, all the imaginary ways in which man experience their real world, which is, of course, the kind of experience literature gives us. What it feels like to live in a particular conditions rather than a conceptual analysis of those conditions. However, art does more than just passively reflect that experience. Art, according to Althusser, does not passively reflect that experience. It is part of that ideology. So remember, art cannot be reduced to ideology, but it has a certain relationship to it. Now, this relationship is characterized by a certain distance from it, okay? You cannot produce art, of course, if you do not distance yourself from it. You cannot feel it, you cannot perceive it. But then art holds a particular relationship to ideology in the sense that it is also capable of distancing itself from it in order to feel and perceive the ideology from which it springs. There's also Pierre Macheri, another Marxist literary critics, who speaks about the dyad, illusion versus fiction. Okay, Pierre Macheri distinguishes between what he terms illusion, which is, of course, to him, is essentially ideology. I remember the use of illusion in literary criticism, okay? And illusion and disillusionment, of course, and fiction, okay? So Pierre Macheri distinguishes between these two categories. Now, illusion is for him the ordinary ideological experience of men, okay? And illusion is the material on which the writer goes to work But in working on it, he transforms it into something different, gives it a shape and a structure. It is by giving ideology a determinate form, fixing it within certain fictional limits, that art is able to distance itself from it. Remember again the idea of distance, thus revealing, which is the opposite of concealing, thus revealing to us the limits of that ideology. Now, for Masheri, art, uh, 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 there is something salvatory about art, because it delivers us from our ideological illusion, okay? From our ideological illusion, which is in a sense being unaware of the very things that govern the way our ideas are produced, and how these ideas come to rule us as individuals. Okay, George Lucas. George Lucas is a Hegelian critic, Marxist critic, of course. Uh, Remember, I spoke earlier about the epic. Now, George Lucas has this idea to tell us. This basic idea to tell us is that the novel as a literary genre, as a form, is in a sense another version of uh, the Greek epic, or the epic in general. But it is, I'm speaking about the novel, but it is an epic which was brought about by the bourgeoisie. Okay? The bourgeoisie. Now, remember the epic hero. The epic hero is somebody who is powerful. He is always the winner. Okay, he is always the winner. Now, when you look at the novel as a literary genre, you find that it is a kind of bourgeois epic. It's the epic of the bourgeoisie, but which is, in a sense, which reveals that bourgeoisie's or humanity's alienation or homelessness in modern society. All right, in modern society. Now, it is, in a sense, he says somewhere else, the novel is, let me say, the epitome of transcendental homelessness. Okay, and of course, homelessness, it means you have no home. Okay, you are alienated from your society, and you're alienated because of the material conditions, but also by the historical circumstances. Okay, that sustain and go into the formation of the novel as a literary genre. So, in Greek classical society, man is at home in the universe, moving within a rounded, complete world of immanent meaning, which is adequate to his soul's demands. The novel arises when that harmonious integration of man and his world is shattered. The hero of fiction is now in search of a totality. The hero of fiction, in a sense, the hero of a novel is not as perfect as the epic hero. Okay? His world is shattered. The hero of fiction is now in search of a totality, is trained from world either too large or too narrow to give shape to his desires. Haunted by.
Excuse me, sir.
Yeah,
I would like to apologize for interrupting you, but
it's okay.
could you Could you please explain this? How is this epic hero related to the concept of Marxism itself? I mean, I'm a little bit confused.
Uh-huh. All right. We spoke earlier about form, okay?
Yes, we did.
Literary form. Now, when we speak about literary form, we could go and speak about poetry. We could speak about subgenres of poetry. These are also literary forms. We could go and speak about the short story. Now, let's take the short story and explain the advent of the short story itself. And then you'll try to understand that in connection with my explanation of the epic no, of the epic hero. Now, the short story. What is a short story? Can you answer me?
Well, a short story is a series of events that contain characters and a lot of literary elements in order to perform. Um, well, it depends on the kind of short story.
Okay. Now we're speaking about the form itself. Okay. Uh, what is it that characterizes a short story
Are you
in
talking about the?
comparison with the novel, for example? In comparison with the novel.
A short story is always shorter than a novel, maybe.
Good. How much time would you take? Would it take you to read a story? A story?
Maybe one day.
Maybe one day, right? You could possibly read a story while going downtown on the bus or on the tram or whatever, right?
Yeah,
Would that be possible with the novel?
absolutely not.
All right, good. Now let's take this element of time and relate it to the historical circumstances that brought about the short story as a form, as a literary genre. Now, why did it emerge in the first place? Well, a Marxist reading of the question would say, look, the development of modernity has made it necessary for a new literary genre to emerge because people are busy and they don't have much time to devote to reading long novels. And so the short story was created. Are you following?
Yes, sir. Yes.
Good. Now, this is one way of looking at the relationship between form and content. Okay? We're not speaking about the form simply in terms of the style, in terms of images and so on and so forth. No, or language. We're also speaking about the very conditions that allowed a literary genre to exist or uh, to die, okay, or to die, okay, or to cease existing. Let's say, okay, to go into demise, okay.
Yes. So you are discussing now the elements that are basically the purpose of the existence of some literary genres, right?
Good. From a Marxist literary criticism perspective, okay.
Yes, got
Now,
it.
now, if you relate that to the epic novel, right? To the epic novel, which I think was your question, was focused on, right? Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yes, yeah.
Okay, so can you say your question again?
Well, at first I wasn't really aware of the form, you know, um, the idea of the existence of literary genres, but now I see. My
Okay.
question was how this epic hero is related to the concept of Marxism at first place.
No, it's a reading. Okay, it's a reading. You read the form. You read the form itself. Okay, you interpret the form itself based on Marxist assumptions. Okay.
Yes,
Now,
sir.
the epic hero, when you look at the epic hero, in fact, you have a number of motifs. Okay, a number of motifs. An epic hero is always goes into an adventure, wars, and so on and so forth. But there is, at the end, there is always a kind of, it's always a success story, right? It's always a success story. In other words, he does not have an epic hero. Is almost faultless. Is almost faultless. Is almost without any weaknesses. He may have some weaknesses, but these weaknesses do not really impede him, do not really impede him from pursuing his goal. Okay? He's always successful. Now, we take into consideration the element of success in the epic hero. Okay, we take that element and we examine it. Now, why is he represented? Why is he always represented as powerful, as without any weaknesses? It's because he reflects a certain ideology that was part of what people believed during the period in which that epic was produced. All right? The universe, as George Lucas has it, the universe of an epic hero is full of hurdles, but he almost always succeeds in overcoming whatever setbacks he encounters. And so he is successful. He is without weaknesses. In fact, he is like a little god, okay? And like the hero of the novel, who, of course, with the passage of time, would develop into a character with flaws and weaknesses. All right. Now, when George Lucas defines the novel as a bourgeois epic, he he's speaking, he's harking back to the Greeks, but at the same time he says that it is an epic that reveals men's homelessness and alienation in modern society. Okay, because his world is shattered. Okay, his world is shattered, and he is in fact looking for totality, one which would be similar to the totality in the epic poem, in the epic as a whole. Okay, as a literary genre. Okay, good. Does that answer your question?
Yes, sir, it does. Thank you.
Can I ask a
So,
question?
so sorry,
I have a question.
who are you? Can you introduce yourself?
I'm طيب نزهدو.
طيب, go ahead. Okay.
Mm.
Now let me just add in this idea. The
All right.
idea, the idea of the epic, the epic hero. The epic hero is almost absolute, like a god. Okay. There is a certain degree of absolutism. He is like a totality. He can do everything and anything. Okay. He is powerful. He thrives over his enemies, his opponents, and so on and so forth. And he returns home successful. He returns home successful. All right, unlike the fictional hero, or unlike some versions of fictional heroes, because fictional heroes in the early novel, in the early 18th century, some of them were absolute in this sense. Okay, were powerful in this sense. Okay, good. Yes, go ahead, Taib.
What I understood is that Marxism consider literature as one of the means through which the ruling class, let's say, practice their ideology, or in other
Yeah.
words, it's a part of the superstructure. But
Yeah.
but we also have the kind of literature that makes the working class conscious about their true power, or
Good.
that removes the mask, as you said.
Good.
I mean, what does Marxism says about this kind of literature?
Well, this kind of literature is true art according to literary criticism. That's true art because it was capable, in the first place, if it unmasks the relations of power and the relations of exploitation. Basically, it's because it had transcended the ideological limits that were put on it by by the ruling system, right? And that it has gone beyond. In fact, it has like traveled in history, in time, not in history, traveled in time to the future, and has grasped what it was at stake. Okay, what it was at stake, because it was capable of unmasking, of revealing those relations of exploitation, let's say. Okay, of it has unmasked the false consciousness, in a sense, of a social class. Does that answer your question?
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Well, it's almost 12, so we're going to move. Lucien Goldman, this is a French critic who came up with what he called genetic structuralism. Okay. Now, Goldman is concerned with examining, he's concerned to examine the structure of a literary text for the degree to which it embodies the structure of thought. Now, remember, the structure of thought, Lucien Goldman's concept, the structure of thought, or the world vision, if you will, and then the structure of feeling, which we will speak about shortly, brought about by Raymond Williams. Now, the structure of thought, or the world vision, or the social class, or the group to which the writer belongs. Now, according to Lucien Goldman, when you study a literary text, you have to examine the structure of thought. The closer you get to that structure of thought, the better you are in a position to understand that literary work. Okay, the more closely the text approximates a complete, coherent articulation of the social class's world vision, the greater is its validity as a work of art. It is only a work of art if it catches the structure of thought. Raymond Williams would say the structure of feeling. And of course, the structure of thought is that thing, that structure, that realm out of which the ideas and the world vision and the world view of the writer springs, because the writer, after all, is a human being. He or she is a social being, and he belongs in a social class, and that social class has a certain ideology. Now, that ideology may not be the structure of thought, but the structure of thought may be an amalgamation, let's say, between the writer's social class, or the ideology of the ideology of the writer, which is of course part of the ideology of his social class, and something else, okay? And something else, all right? Which is another way, a different, an opposed way of thinking. So much so that you end up, the work of art, the literary work, reflects a mental structure that goes beyond an individual, that goes beyond a single social class. Now, at that point, it is considered a work of art. If it falls below that, if it falls short of that, it's not a work of art, okay? If it falls short of that, it is not really a work of art. It is a product. It's a literary product like any other literary product, but it's not a work of art, okay? So let us recapitulate. The structure of thought, or the world vision, or the social class, the ideology of the social class, or the social group to which the writer belongs, is to be reflected, is to be found in a literary work. And this structure of thought is not individual, or is not even, should not even be the reflection of the ideology of one social class, but it is something that goes beyond the individual. Now, sometimes you in literary criticism, you find some literary critics who would while speaking about a literary critic, a literary writer, would extol the capabilities of the writer. Look at this beautiful poem. Look at the way, look at the refinement of the language, and also attributing those qualities to the individual writer, or to the individual poet, when in fact the real worth of a literary work, or a poem for that matter, lies in the idea, lies in its capability, to reflect what goes beyond the individual mental structures, okay? That is, it is capable of reflecting, of unveiling, of masking the structure of thought prevalent in that very historical period. Raymond Williams, of course, the structure of thought, according to Lucien Goldman and according to Raymond Williams, the British Marxist critic, the structure of feeling. Of course, he spoke about. He came up with many concepts, right? Now, Raymond Williams argued that literature is not autonomous, unlike Leon Trotsky, for example, in his book Literature and Revolution, which was published in 1925, if my memory is good. So literature is not autonomous, according to Raymond Williams. In other words, a novel, the ideas that you find in a novel, in a work of art, come from somewhere. They do not come from the individual author himself or herself. No, the literature is not autonomous. Okay, it's not autonomous. It is dependent on history. Okay, it is dependent on history. It is also dependent on culture, and culture is in turn dependent on history. All right, let's see in more detail. For him, literature is a carrier of class values. Okay, for Raymond Williams, literature is a carrier of class values. Now, to see this, you just have to read a novel by, I don't know, Charles Dickens, to be able to see that literature is a carrier of class values. Charles Dickens' Hard Times, for example, lends itself to a Marxist reading, okay? Mostly because it is set in an industrial fictional setting, okay? Literature is a carrier of class values. And of course, Raymond Williams was a cultural critic also. He was one of the founders of cultural studies, right? He was one of the founders of cultural studies, and he had a lot to say about culture and cultural studies, of course, which he described as a whole way of life. Okay, culture is described by Raymond Williams as a whole way of life. That is, it includes individual practices, but also collective practices, including literature. Okay, Raymond Williams comes up with the concept of structure of feeling and the dominant, the residual, and emergent categories to explain the dynamics of change. Now, when you speak about change, of course, when you speak about change, you are undoubtedly speaking about history, okay? Because without history, there's no change. If you have no notion of history, then you will have ultimately no notion of change, whether it is social change, political change, or whatever form of change there may be, all right? Now, the dominant, the residual, and the emergent. These are three categories that go into the formation of culture and ultimately literature, okay? And that are responsible for the creation, for the reflection of the structure of feeling, according to Raymond Williams, okay? Now, they are ways of negotiating the structures of feeling. Of course, if you negotiate the structure of feeling, then you are negotiating your way into the maze of what he calls the dominant, the residual, and the emergent. Simply put, these three categories, if you speak about the dominant, whatever, dominant practices, dominant values, dominant ideas, are those things, or those ideas, those values, those worldviews that dominate culture during a specific period of time. You would say, for example, that nowadays the mobile phone is a dominant means of communication, or social media platforms are a dominant means of communication. You agree, of course, right?
Yes, Professor, we do.
Good. So that's the now, if you want to get in touch with someone, would you write them a letter?
Calling
No.
them would be easy.
Now, would you write in a natural environment? I mean, naturally, would you go for a letter?
Maybe a message, sir.
Maybe, but if you interview like 100 youth in Morocco or in the States or wherever, and ask them if you want to get in touch with a friend, how would you go about it? Would you rather text them or write them a letter? What would they say? Most of them. I mean, if I ask you,
I think
has
they're going to go
anybody,
for a message.
has anyone amongst you written a letter to their friends?
For
No.
me, no.
No. Is there somebody who has? Nobody. Still, writing letters is or was a means of communication, right? But
Yeah.
it has fallen into abeyance, let's say. It has fallen into disuse. It is not used anymore, but it is there, dormant in our culture. If, for example, something happens and there is no possibility of using a mobile phone or Facebook or whatever, then you'd be forced to fall back on letter writing. It is there. It is part of culture, but it is a residual form. Okay? It's a residual component. It is part of culture, but it's not dominant, right? Do you agree?
Yes,
It
Professor.
may emerge. It may emerge at a certain period of time if the necessary conditions are fulfilled, and then it becomes emergent. In culture in general, if you apply the idea of the residual, and the dominant to the recent history, for example, of to the recent history of the Arab world, starting from 1928, for example, with the advent of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. I mean, before 1927 or 1928, because there are people who say that the Muslim Brotherhood, Ikhwan al-Muslimin, Harakat Ikhwan al-Muslimin, which emerged in Egypt. There are some historians of ideas who say it started in 1927, but Tozi, for example, says it emerged in 1928 in his book Islam et Monarchie or Maroc. All right. So let's try and think about this idea of the Muslim Brotherhood uh, from the perspective of the emergent. Now, before 1927, the Arabs or the people, the populations in the Arab world were not Muslim? Can you answer me?
No, they were.
They were Muslim. Why didn't we have the birth or the advent or the emergence of the Muslim Brotherhood, for example?
I would say that because the systems that govern at that point of time was monarchs all over those parts of the world.
All right. Okay. Another explanation would be to look at the emergence of that political theory in terms of the emergent. It emerged. It was residual. It was where? Residual where? In our culture, in our tradition, in the our political history, the way the Muslim world has, the Muslim or the Arab world has developed over the centuries, okay, based on the idea of Khilafah, okay, the Caliphate, and so on and so forth. But it stayed there in books, okay, in history books, in what we call, in what Muhammad Abdul Jabri would call a Turath, our tradition, okay? It was there, dormant. It was only in the 1920s that that the conditions for its emergence were fulfilled because of some political conditions, because of the historical circumstances that went into it or that led to its birth. But before that, it was a residue, something there, but we were not really, we were aware of it, but we didn't use it, okay? Or those who fashioned that theory didn't pay attention to it. So it was residual. And then it became emergent. It became emergent. At the beginning, it became emergent. If you look, for example, at the historical trajectory of the development of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, and of course, this is also this is not literary criticism, but it's criticism in general. Okay, this is criticism in general because it is applied to politics and not to a literary work. Okay, you may want to apply it to a literary work. Okay, but this thing, this Muslim Brotherhood, I think, lends itself more to this analysis based on Raymond Williams' ideas of the dominant, the residual, and the emergent. Okay, so at the beginning of the development of the Muslim Brotherhood, it was not a political movement, because it was just emerging. All right, it was just emerging. That's the emergent, according to Raymond Williams, right? But then what happened? It spread all across the Arab world, Muslim world. So much so that nowadays we have in Morocco, as well as in other countries, in Arab countries, governments which whose ideology is based on the idea of the Muslim Brotherhood. العدالة والتنمية in Morocco, for example, or العدالة والتنمية also in Turkey, all right? Although the trajectories are quite different, okay? Although the trajectories are quite different, and the context is quite different because Turkey is not Morocco. The in Turkey is a secular country. Okay, Turkey is a secular country, and like Morocco, which is not really a completely secular country, because in our constitution it says that Morocco is a Muslim country. Okay, Morocco is a Muslim country. All right, now it has become a dominant component in the in the Arab culture, right? This idea of the Islam is the solution. Are you following, right?
Yes.
Good. Does that explain a little bit the idea of the dominant and the residual and the emergent as forms of ideological negotiation of the structure of feeling?
Professor?
Yeah.
May I just say that it is a part of what we already have in our culture, our history, and it's just like it resides in a part because of the changes the society goes, and it is just waiting there for
Yes,
the
very good.
right moments to
Yes, very
emerge.
good. It's waiting there to emerge. All right?
Okay, I
It's
get that.
waiting there to emerge. You may apply it to, I don't know, to literary work. Let me remember the title. Look, if you read one or many novels by the Moroccan writer Abdullah Taye, who writes about homosexuality, you would make sense of the idea of the emergent, right? You would make sense of the idea of the emergent. Of course, in our culture, before, people were incapable of writing about homosexuality, but Abdullah Taye has come to write about homosexuality in the context of Morocco, right? Because of course, although he's living in Paris, he is Moroccan. He was born in Morocco and he lived for a long spell of his life in Morocco. Okay, in Morocco, if my memory is good, in Saleh more precisely, and that's the idea of the emergent. Okay, this is another facet of the emergent. Okay, the structure of feeling is a stage that precedes the disagreement against the dominant. Now, in society, in Morocco, do we all agree that that the party that this party justice what is it called, justice and development?
العدالة والتنمية.
Yeah, justice and development. Do all Moroccans agree that uh, that party is the solution to Morocco's political problems?
No, of course, we don't
No.
agree.
No, of course. So there is no hegemony. That party has a partial hegemony over the political arena in Morocco. All right. Now, the structure of feeling is negotiated, okay? On social media platforms, you find people who are for and people who are against, people who say, no, Islam is the solution to everything. There are people who say, no, Islam is just a religion and it's not a form of political, is not a form of political governance, and so on and so forth, right? Good, of course, we have so many things to add, but then it's time. It's 12:30. Look, have you got any questions?
No, sir.
Are you sure? Now, if you have any questions, have you understood what we've been talking about? I mean, it may not be enough, because Marxist literary theory is not just one thing, all right? There are versions in Marxist literary theory, and understanding it would entail reading a lot of works, okay? A lot of works. But maybe you could read Lois Tyson, in that book of his, critical theory today. You'll understand a lot of things, okay? Of course, if you read also Rafi Habib, you'll understand what literary criticism is, because he devotes a chapter to literary criticism, to Marxist literary criticism, to be more precise, okay? So, if you don't have any questions, I'll say goodbye, right? It was nice.
Goodbye, Professor.
Goodbye. Thank you. Goodbye,
Thank you,
everybody.
sir.
Thank you. See you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.